Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you to the side event, Building Capacities and Developing Tools to Enable Ambition Article 6 Cooperation. The event had a bit of a tormented history. It's an event that was submitted by 3 observer organizations, Perspectives Climate Research, the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies, and then also the International Climate Dialogue. The challenge was that despite having a group of 3 observer organizations, the event was initially rejected by the Secretariat. Then I intervened and we got this slot. So we were quite happy that we can have the event, but of course the slot has the drawback that it's running in parallel with Article 6.4 negotiations. So the whole target group is sitting over there and discussing probably some aspects of what we will be discussing here as well. But yeah, I hope that still the event will be able to provide some input into these negotiations, because yeah, after COP26, having the decision on Article 6, of course now it's the time of getting into the nitty-gritties, and of course the nitty-gritties relate to baseline methodologies, MRV and additionality. So in the event we will have 4 components. I'll give a short framework. Then my colleague Juliana Kessler from Perspectives Climate Research will describe the setting of the International Initiative for Development of Article 6 Methodology Tools. That's an initiative that has been running now for a number of months, and that is just starting its second phase. And then we'll have the experts of the initiative coming in virtually. We have experts from all around the world, from Colombia, from the US, and from Uganda. And thanks to our virtual side event technology, we can bring them in today, where we are really happy that the Secretariat has sustained this technology, because I think it makes events much more inclusive. And then afterwards we'll have a panel discussion and to bring you in as an audience. Of course, we were having a panel with some real Article 6 negotiating experts who will now be sitting in the other room, but I'm happy that at least half of our panel is with us, Luca from the International Energy Agency and Karschunk from the German Federal Environment Agency. So that will give us the opportunity to really get into the nitty-gritty discussions also with you. And we'll also try, of course, to bring in our experts that are participating virtually. So if we now are setting the scene, I want to use a graphic example. We have a big body of CDM methodologies, more than 250, that have been developed over the last 15 years, some even longer. Some of them have undergone 25 revisions throughout the year. So this is really a time-tested and well-applied body of experience. Any one of you who has been involved in development of such methodology knows it takes years to develop such methodology, and it can become really costly. A cost of $100,000 to $200,000 for a methodology is not extraordinary. So we have those methodologies, and now of course we have the risk that if we start from scratch for development of Article 6 methodologies, it will take us many years and it will be very costly. Therefore, we need to bridge this potential valley of death of methodology use under Article 6, and we want to do this by having tools that can be grafted on the CDM methodologies. So let's say 2/3 of the CDM methodology would still be fully applicable, but 1/3 would be supplemented by the tool that brings in the principles that have been agreed in Glasgow. Of course, not only baseline methodologies, but also additionality determination is an important issue. Those of you who followed the mechanisms know that additionality has been really in the limelight from the beginning of the mechanisms. It has been severely contested between private sector developers, NGOs, researchers, and now, at least under the COP26 decision, we have a better overall framing of the concept of additionality, but which of course now needs to be fully operationalized. And I'm using this graph of the tug of war between the different institutions involved and interests, just to show that this, of course, is an issue that has really serious repercussions and should not be taken lightly. So if we look into the key principles of methodologies under Article 6, and these are, of course, Article 6.4 principles that we would hope diffuse also into Article 6.2 collaboration, because we should not have a situation where one does quick and dirty things under Article 6.2 and very stringent things under 6.4. We now have, of course, this issue of encouraging ambition over time. Under the CDM, there was nothing about increasing ambition over time. It was just stated that it should provide offset credits to be used against the industrialized country targets of the Kyoto Protocol. So now we have really here a much wider remit of the methodologies. We also have, of course, the interesting interaction between the principle of suppressed demand and the alignment with the long-term target of the Paris Agreement, which, of course, may not be easy to resolve. So I'm looking forward to the discussion how this can actually be achieved. Of course, one may think of different temporal slices. And then, of course, we have now the very important new principles that a baseline should be below business as usual. Under CDM, it was clear it should be at the level of business as usual. And that also it should currently be below, well, the historical levels adjusted downwards. So now we have two generic principles that ask the baseline to be more stringent than historic emissions, than business as usual emissions. Again, of course, this needs to be operationalized, but the principle itself is very clear. And of course, we also have an important statement that relates to carbon dioxide removals, that methodologies should actually address reversals in full. Again, a very far-reaching principle where we need to see how it can be implemented. So just in order to illustrate the approach, how one could operationalize historical emissions adjusted downwards, there is the possibility to apply a so-called ambition coefficient, which would be a multiplier that starts at 1 at the beginning of the period and that reaches 0 at the point in time where the host country should have a net zero target. So it will move downwards over the years and of course mean that the overall baseline emission factor will also move downwards to eventually reach the value of 0. So with that, I would like to pass to Juliana, who will lay out our initiative and what we want to achieve with it. Juliana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. So these considerations that have just been outlined by Axel have basically led to the establishment of the international initiative for development of Article 6 methodology tools, in brief IIAMT as we call it. And I would like to quickly introduce in the following minutes the IIAMT. So it's basically an initiative that was launched by Perspectives Climate Research this January, and it brings together a group of international methodology experts to develop a set of tools that can complement CDM methodologies to meet Article 6 methodological requirements. And 3 of these, or with Axel, 4 of these experts, but 3 virtually, are also present today and will introduce the progress that has so far been made in a few minutes after my presentation. The initiative has so far been supported by the Swedish Energy Agency, by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, by the Japanese Ministry of Environment, and the African Development Bank Group. And the objective of the initiative is really to align approved CDM methodologies with Article 6 principles and rules to prevent, as Axel put it nicely at the beginning of this session, the valley of death. And this shall be achieved through the development of Article 6 tools that can be added to existing baseline and monitoring methodologies in a sort of a modular fashion. So in this way, like the rapid operationalization of market-based cooperation under Article 6 is supported, as Article 6 methodologies do not have to be developed from scratch, which is very time-consuming and costly. And the Article 6 tools to be developed shall cover 4 different dimensions. So the first one is the contributions to host country NDCs and long-term strategies and goals. Then the demonstration and assessment of additionality, robust baseline setting, and the 4th one is the monitoring, reporting, and verification of emissions and emission reductions. The team basically consists of 7 methodology experts, and each of them works on usually on 2 dimensions. And process-wise, they are supported by perspective staff. And then we have the advisory group, which is like a broad interdisciplinary group that provides additional input and also some form of verification at the end of each phase. That brings me to the phases of the IIAMT. There are basically 3 phases. So the first one has already been completed. It was running from January to April, and it's the conceptualization phase, meaning that 4 concepts for each dimension 1 have been developed throughout the last 4 months. And also the work plan of the initiative, and that has then been validated. And now we are currently in the tool development phase. So this is really the phase in which, based on these concept notes we developed, in the first phase, we now develop the actual tools and also gonna conduct stakeholder consultation processes. So to sort of have some sort of validation through this consultation of the tools. And then next year, from March to August 2023, there will be the 3rd phase, which is the piloting and submission phase. And during this phase, there will be a help desk for pilot activities and potentially also submission to the Article 6.4 supervisory body, and obviously the revision of tools based on new input. What concerns the approach during phase 1, so we started with experts agreeing on a set of key principles and guardrails to guide the development of the concept notes that are well known and established for carbon crediting, like conservativeness and consistency. And then, the documents were operationalized and they enshrine, basically based on both. So the principles enshrined in the Article 6.2 guidance and also in the Article 6.4 rules, modalities, and procedures, and they adhere to both shall and should requirements. And then afterwards, there was an iterative process among the experts to review and also sharpen the concept notes, and further input was provided by the advisory group. And what's important to mention is that the tools are sector and technology agnostic and applicable to single and programmatic activities, but not to like sectoral and policy approaches. And this also implies that the tool will have to be complemented with further sector-specific guidance, especially what concerns like land use and forestry activities, to be applicable to all activity types. And this has then resulted in the outputs. So the outputs of the first phase are these 4 concept nodes. We have 3 tools and 1 guidance that is relevant for all the tools. So the tool 1 is the one for demonstration and assessment of additionality, and then we have the second tool focusing on robust baseline setting, the third one, tool on MRV, and then the guidance for contributions to host country NDC and long-term strategies, which is relevant for all tools, and there are also cross-references in the tools to that NDC guidance. What concerns the outlook, so the next step is basically to move from these concept nodes to actual tools until early 2023. And this development will also take into account assessments of their applicability in different country contexts and associated transaction costs. And obviously this will not happen in a sort of vacuum, so the experts are really are going to seek input from stakeholders, and the insights that will be generated during this phase will also be disseminated through policy briefs. And during the piloting phase that will start next year in March, the experts will also be involved in this test of the tools and will support activity developers with, to advise on certain questions and to provide clarification. And last but not least, the final IIMG products will then also be made publicly available ready to be used for Article 6.2 cooperative approaches and potentially to be considered by the Article 6.4 supervisory body and independent standards for approval. And with that, I would hand over to our virtual experts, and the first one is Jessica Wade-Murphy, who will introduce the additionality concept node.
Thank you, Juliana. How is the sound?
It's good. It's great.
Okay, and then greetings from Bogota, Colombia, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today at this session. I'm going to introduce the bases that we've developed in the concept note for additionality. And I'm going to share a presentation about this subject. Could you also confirm that you can see the presentation in presentation mode?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. So the concept note for additionality responds to the need for mitigation activities to have additionality. I just wanted to say, of course, why is additionality important? I mean, the objective is that the additionality test will ensure that only the mitigation outcomes that require carbon market support are credited under baseline and credit schemes. This responds to the Article 6.4 requirement or for additionality, that it means that a project would not have occurred in absence of the incentives of the mechanism. And I want to emphasize too that additionality is so critical because offsetting with non-additional mitigation in the context of AP 6.4 would lead to an overall increase in global emissions, which is completely counter to the goal of overall mitigation of global emissions that should come about with application of this mechanism. So additionality is a cornerstone to having a high integrity operational Article 6.4 mechanism. So the concept that we developed is for a standalone tool that can help projects and programs demonstrate additionality in the context of the Article 6.4 mechanism. And in this case, baseline setting is undertaken separately and will be addressed by one of my colleagues a little bit later. In the concept note, we've defined a stepwise process for demonstrating additionality in this context. And this builds off of some of the principles of the CDM additionality tool, and then adds and enhances elements to make it fit for purpose in the Article 6.4 context. So one thing that's been maintained is a public notification prior to the start of the activity. So we're suggesting that prior consideration is important to prove that the benefits of carbon market revenues were considered in the planning of the activity. Again, building off of this, the necessity that the activity would not have occurred in the absence of the incentives from the mechanism. And a second step would be a check of what we might call regulatory additionality. And this is a bit enhanced from the regulatory check that was included in the CDM testing. And so in the context of this concept note, we're proposing two elements to this regulatory additionality. One is obviously checking the activity is not mandated or required by the existing regulatory context in the host country. But another would be to check whether any mandatory regulation that will come into effect in the future has been announced that could be implemented during the plan accrediting period, because it may be important to take this into account for example, limit the crediting period length to only the period when this activity would go above and beyond what is required by national regulation. And so that's the way that this check proposes to be enhanced from what was required under the CDM. A third step that we've developed and proposed in this concept note is an evaluation of risk related to whether the activity is required for NDC achievement. And we're using a term target surplus to capture this element. This is a new element that takes into account, our new context where activities need to contribute but also go beyond the country's NDC target, so that it's not simply contributing to achieving the NDC, which is something that the country has already committed to, but rather even goes beyond that and helps to achieve extra mitigation beyond what's needed to meet the NDC. So this check will have a series of steps to ask, does this activity or the program go beyond what's been promised in the NDC? And because NDCs take different forms, have different levels of specificity, etc., we're proposing a variety of methods that this risk can be evaluated. So methods like looking at an approval list for activities that's already been developed by host country government, or checking against what's described in the NDC, whether the activity goes beyond what's been promised at a certain time within the implementation period. We've also looked at ways to kind of estimate maybe if there is less specific content in the NDC about how the goals will be achieved, if you could set up a mitigation trajectory or have some kind of ambition benchmark that could help you infer what needs to be achieved over time to reach the NDC, and if the project or program's contribution will go beyond that. So the idea is to use the contents of the NDC, suppositions if required, so that we can test how much there is a risk that the activity will simply be needed to meet the NDC, or if it goes beyond what's needed. And the idea in this case is that the results of this evaluation would be to simply flag those risks to the host country. Because the decision really lies with the host country whether an activity represents a target surplus, whether the host country considers that it's needed to meet the NDC, or if it goes beyond and is kind of safe to subject to international transfers. So this step would give a picture that can then be presented to the host country as it makes a decision about authorizing and transferring mitigation outcomes from the activity. The further steps that are being proposed in this concept note are an evaluation of the inherent risks to financial additionality of the activity type. And this is also kind of a new step that's being proposed within this concept note, because it seeks to provide a general view for a project type of how much risk there is for that project type to being successfully implemented. So a project that faces no risk to being successfully implemented would have a very high risk to showing additionality, of course. So part of the step is to look at project, activity types, and ask, ask and describe what are these inherent additionality risks? Like, is there evidence of profitability? Is there evidence of ample experience with that activity type in the country? Are there plenty of competitive financing sources available, et cetera? So that would be part of that risk analysis. And another check would be, what are the inherent risks to actually implementing the project type? For example, is there a risk because the payback period is very long? Are there technical barriers? Is there lack of access to financing? And so this would result in a risk analysis where risk would be scored, and it would be clear whether a project was facing kind of a high risk to actually being additional or a low one. And this general analysis of the activity type would set the stage for an investment analysis, or what type of investment analysis to apply. The goal here is that if it's found that a certain activity type faces very low risk to additionality, i.e. if it tends to not be profitable without carbon finance, etc., then it wouldn't need to go to the next stage and undertake an investment analysis. Whereas projects that do have kind of higher medium risks to truly being additional would need to go on to a second step, which would be kind of specific project or program analysis. So that next step is the last one in the concept note, and that's determining financial additionality through investment analysis. And this has been enhanced a bit as compared to what was applied previously under the CDM. And so this step would be mandatory, as I said, if it was found that the risks to additionality for the project type were medium or high, as found in that previous more general look. And it would seek to identify if the activity is likely to be unattractive if it doesn't have the carbon revenues. And so in this way, the tool provides, or will seek to provide the step-by-step process to giving a very rigorous view on what is the probability that an activity is truly additional. And so with that, I close on the overview of the concept for additionality. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion shortly.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Are there any clarification questions from the audience on Jessica's overview of the additionality concept note? I'm not seeing that, so of course we can come back to that later. Thanks a lot, and now we move on to Martha.
Good evening. I'll just try to share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
No, not yet.
Can you confirm if you can? Okay.
Now we can see it.
Perfect. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm hearing a bit of a feedback. I'll just... How is the voice over there?
Excellent. We hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this SB meeting. My name is Martha Ntabadde Kasozi. I am coming all the way from Uganda. I bring you warm greetings from Kampala, Uganda, and thank you for the opportunity to present this concept note on MRV. So this particular concept note on MRV, the objective was to provide general guidance on an MRV framework for Article 6 activities. Yeah. Now you see that this particular concept note was structurally different from the other concept notes that have been or are about to be presented, in the sense that we aim to build on the existing MRV components under the CDM so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah. So we already have a relatively good framework under the CDM. So the purpose of this was try and see how can we build on that to enhance the existing elements in order to satisfy the requirements under Article 6. Yeah. So in order to do this, we have looked at the existing key decision text of the Article 6, as well as the subsequent guidance documents with rules and principles enshrined in them that have MRV components. And these have been reviewed to come up with the different elements that we'll be looking at to assess the MRV aspects of Article 6 activities. Now, in particular, we have looked at the guidance for cooperative approaches under Article 6, paragraph 2, and then the rule, modalities, and procedures for Article 6.4 mechanisms, as well as the mechanisms, procedures, and guidelines for the enhanced transparency framework. Yeah, we have further also reviewed the Marrakesh Accord of 2001, which we thought relevant because they defined or gave the guidance on what would be the key requirements for the monitoring plan of CDM and JI activities, project activities. So based on this assessment of the different rules and principles, you have come up with the key elements that you consider essential for MRV aspects of Article 6 activities. Yeah. So these have been split into two. They're completely new elements, which are mainly 4. And there are also some existing elements that we considered that were sufficiently addressed under the CDM and will only require a minor refinement to tweak them to be appropriate for Article 6. So the focus has been on the new elements, which include conservativeness, yeah, which is more stringent to what we had the definition under the CDM. And then there's a new component of monitoring of all relevant policies. And then the monitoring of reversals, which is also a completely new aspect. Yeah, this will be addressed in the next slide in detail, as well as the sustainable development tool, yeah, or monitoring of sustainable development core benefits, which was only voluntary under the CDM and it was non-mandatory. Yeah, so in the review of the different guidance documents also, we came up across various terms that require definitions. So we attempted to define these initially in the concept note, but these will be further defined in detail during the development phase and in such a manner that they are applicable across the various tools that will be developed under this initiative. So in the development of the concept known, there are some key issues that arose mainly relating to the new elements that need to be elaborated in the development phase. One of these is to how do we integrate the elements proposed in the monitoring process and the steps undertaken by the program developer. So basically, how do we take the guidelines that is provided in the tool and interpret it at the activity level, yeah? And of course, when it comes to baseline emissions, there'll be need to link this MRV module with the baseline module or the baseline tool, yeah? And we have already talked about how that will be achieved, yeah? And then moving forward, you need to define what exactly qualifies as a relevant policy to start with. And then having defined what a relevant policy is, what would be considered to be an appropriate level of aggregation of these things. And you have wider policies at activity level. Yeah. So how do you bring it down to the activity level when you have, let's say, a sector-wide policy? Yeah. And then how do we assess the degree of enforcement of these policies? And then how do we interpret it as far as the activity implementation is concerned? Yeah. So all these will have to be addressed in the project development phase. And then another key aspect that you mentioned, a key element that is included in the MRV aspects of Article 6 activities, is the monitoring of reversals. Of course, this is, as we said, is a completely new element. Under the CDM, it has not been done before. So we are looking to see the best practice that is existing at the moment, such as the gold standard and the verified carbon standard, who have already proposed approaches for this sort of thing. For example, the possibility of using buffer reserves, yeah, whether that is based on a fixed percentage or a varying percentage, depending on the degree of the risk of reversal. Yeah, so that will be detailed in the development phase. And then, of course, the fourth element that we talked about is the sustainable development tool. As we know, there's already an existing CDM sustainable development tool, but this still lacks in various aspects, including quantification of core benefits, which is lacking. And then there is also a lack of safeguards against negative core benefits. And these we hope we can see how to address in the development of the new sustainable development tool, as well as reference to other existing tools, such as what the gold standard is using. Yeah. And then the other question that we need to address is how do we define the boundary of the core benefits, sustainable development core benefits. Yeah. And then previously, the monitoring of sustainable development benefits was not mandatory. So they didn't need to be assessed. So now who will verify the sustainable development contribution of the various activities? So all this will have to be addressed in the development phase, yeah? And of course, also the difficulty in quantification of sustainable development impacts, yeah? So we'll need to provide some sort of guideline basing on what has been done, for example, under the Japanese JCM, as well as some experience from Africa. Yeah, so I think my time is up. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martha. Any clarification question from the audience? Yes, microphone is coming.
Hi, hello, my name is Nadine Planzer. I work for SustainCert. This question is for Martha regarding the sustainable development tool. I seen there that you said, verification of the impacts, and something that we're obviously very interested in doing, and think that that's probably the best way to go to indeed verify impacts. So I'm just wondering, have you had a bit of thought about how that would look like? Also aggregation of the SD impacts to national, global level. Obviously in carbon markets, you have the SDGs that are monitored under gold standard, and just wondering if there's been some thought about piloting with verifiers and whether you have an idea of how this would look in the future.
Martha, I hope you were able to hear the question. Please come in.
Yes, at this moment, we have not gotten into the details of how exactly that is to be achieved. But of course, some of the things we have discussed is the fact that what is done elsewhere is the mapping of the core benefits against the different sustainable development goals, and then having some sort of quantitative assessment for the different core benefits, yeah, with some guidelines on how that quantification can be achieved, yeah. Of course, the issue of pilot, like Juliana said initially, we hope to have a pilot, and we hope that these are some of the elements where we can kind of test drive what we would have come up with to see, is it really something that is workable or not, yeah? And how do we modify it to make sure that it is workable and it can be applied?
Thank you. Further clarification question? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Takashi Hongo, Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute. So I have almost the same question. It's how to use sustainable development tools. In my understanding, the MRV, the aim of the MRV is quantification of the reduction or avoidance. So if you are combined the sustainable development tools, so that means yes or no, or if some kind of difficulty or some element that you find at the sustainable development factor, you will deduct the reduction or approved amount. So quantification and the judgment of yes or no, I'm not sure how to use sustainable development tools for calculating the reduction or removal amount, quantification. Thank you.
Thank you. Martha, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think that nitty-gritty on whether what happens after you have quantified the sustainable development benefits, whether they're positive or negative, and then how that is applied to the initially estimated quantity of emissions reductions or removals, that will have to be discussed as well, yeah? Like I said, there's a lot of consultation that needs to be done on how exactly this can be actualized. What you're looking at the moment is to draw a roadmap, what is required, and then moving forward, we'll have to see how do we implement this in the practically as far as project implementation is concerned, yeah? So I may not have like 100% of the answers, but it's something that we shall be looking at in detail. Of course, my colleagues are welcome to have some input if they have something to say about the different questions that have been raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. There is no specific input from the other colleagues. Of course, we don't want to duplicate. Okay. Well, Karen, please, if you want to come in on that.
Just on the sustainable development tool that you put under MRV, and the question is, what is the relationship to the CDM, I mean not CDM, but the sustainable development tool that the supervisory body is mandated to develop by end 2023 for assessing sustainable development impacts. I do expect that we would have some inputs on what exists in the practices in the market. There's also the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market that are developing principles and criteria for assessment of sustainable development impacts. So maybe it's a standalone thing, but just for where you put it, I think that it is, as you also noted, it is great to see that you include MRV of sustainable development impacts in that tool, because we didn't have that in the past.
Thanks, Karen. So, of course, what I would like to stress is there are various attempts to develop sustainable development tools. So, of course, we don't want to duplicate any of that work. What we want to ensure is that there is an anchor in these tools where we can actually ensure that we plug in a dedicated sustainable development MRV. Good. With that, I would like to pass on to Clayton for the baseline setting tool. Clayton, you have the floor.
Thanks, Axel. And can you all hear me all right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. And let's see, can you see my presentation?
Yes, slide is visible.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm presenting, I'm Clayton Munnings, founder and principal of Munnings Consulting LLC. So I'll just say good morning from Berkeley, California. And with that, I'll just thank Axel for the invitation and thank you all for attending and jump into discussing the concept of no baselines. So I don't think this group really needs this, but as background on the importance of baselines, accrediting baseline sets the reference level of greenhouse gas emissions for a given activity. And the difference between the baseline and activity defines the volume of mitigation outcome generated by that activity. And that's why, of course, baselines are so important. As you know, baselines can never be known with certainty, and therefore there are numerous approaches to estimating business as usual emissions. You see that reflected in some of the Paris Agreement, and is really the focus of the concept note here. Our main objective is to provide guidance for robust baseline setting under Article 6, given lessons learned from the clean development mechanism. And the concept note, really the work of it, is to reflect and begin to operationalize as a tool the rules and principles outlined by Article 6.2 and 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. There are a lot of complexities in both of those Articles 6.2 and 6.4. The main themes are conservativeness and below business as usual mission on the one hand, and a dynamic element encouraging ambition over time. And then, of course, alignment to Paris Agreement goals and country-level long-term greenhouse gas strategies. It also explicit mention of 3 options for baseline setting, and that will really form the heart of this concept note. So with that as an emphasis on key aspects, I will move on to the 2 slides that really represent what we have done in the concept note. These 2 figures are not meant to be read. The text is probably very small, but I just wanted to highlight. This is figure 1 is a summary of the steps I'm about to walk through in a visual format. And I just wanted to flash this figure on the screen to show that there are many decision points as we walk through the 5 steps that I'll elaborate on in the next slide. And figure 2 shows the zoom in on step 2, which is an assessment of the appropriateness of performance benchmarking for sectors. That this is a key step in the 5 steps I'll discuss in the next slide. I more wanted to flash these just quickly to show an overview of where we're going, but also hopefully direct you to the concept note, since I think these visual aids are useful to understand the basic steps. So without further ado, right on this, I guess, 5+ step process that we have arrived at. So there's a step 0, or what we are also calling a pre-step, which is really eligibility criteria. So each Article 6 activity must fulfill an eligibility criteria that basically measures alignment of the activity with the long-term targets of the Paris Agreement. And how we propose implementing this is before a baseline setting option can even be chosen, the proposed activity must pass this eligibility assessment. And particularly, we propose several restrictions on eligible activities. I'll review a few of these restrictions here. The first and perhaps most obvious is that the activity can't be on any negative list. The other 2 restrictions I'll mention is if there is a long-term low emissions development strategy, then the proposed activity and associated activity emissions scenario must be in line with the long-term greenhouse gas strategy of the country. If there is not a long-term low emissions strategy, then the proposed activity must not lead to a lock-in of current emissions levels or continuation of carbon-intensive practices. So this is our effort to kind of screen out as ineligible some project activities should not move forward under Article 6. So assuming the project activity passes the eligibility assessment, it will then undergo this 5-step process, step 1 of which is an assessment of the appropriateness of performance benchmarking for the sector's targeted activity. So this is the initial kind of parsing or categorization of where the project activity should go in terms of setting baselines. So we've come up with a few heuristics that we are proposing be implemented here. So for example, if there's homogeneous production in a sector that the activity is housed in, that is the sector exhibits comparable goods and services, then either the best available technology or an ambitious benchmark approach must be chosen. So these are options 1 and 2 as outlined under the Paris Agreement. If there is a lack of data on the performance of technologies at the entity level, at the country or region level, then option 2, which is an ambitious benchmark, must be chosen. And this is given because if there's not data, then we probably should not take the best available technology approach. And then finally, if the sector exhibits significant variation across entities, then option 3, which is an actual or historical emissions adjusted downward, must be chosen. And this is because if there's significant heterogeneity, it's really hard to pick a best available technology or an ambitious benchmark that is accurate and avoids perverse incentives like adverse selection. So that's not quite a comprehensive form, but it gives you a flavor of the intent and operational nature of step 1. And once that sorting is done, we move on to step 2, which are different ways for setting baselines and different guidelines for the 3 options. Again, the options are best available technology, ambitious benchmark approach, and then actual or historical emissions adjusted downward. For each of these options, the general approach with some subtlety is that it's really a 2-part approach. There is further guidance, usually aimed at defining terms or definitions, and then we usually apply this concept of an ambition coefficient, which Axel alluded to at the beginning of his remarks. So for example, setting the baseline in relation to best available technologies, under this option, we focus on identifying and defining best available technology at the country or regional level if necessary, and then we suggest a downward baseline emissions intensity over time to ensure the long-term reaching of the Paris Agreement emission coefficient. And that would be set by the supervisory body for Article 6.4 and by the host country under Article 6.2. Similarly, for the second option, an ambitious benchmark approach, we would have to define and identify the actual performance of all technologies providing similar outputs or services, and then define what the ambitious benchmark is, whether that's 10 or 20% top performing, for example, in a given sector. And then again, we would apply the ambition coefficient. And then option 3, this option is only available for activities in a host country with either net zero pathway target or net zero pathway or target for a long-term low emissions development scenario. And then after a series of determinations, we would again apply an ambition coefficient. In this scenario, it's important to note that the ambition coefficient would be set based on an NDC period with considerations for what might happen after an NDC period ends. Ideally, an ambition coefficient would be differentiated across sectors, and these pathways would be updated every 5 years. At step 2, there is a third step to make sure that there's good alignment of the activity level baseline with the NDC. And we have 2-part guidance here. If there's a sector-specific NDC unconditional target, then that is downscaled to the activity level. And if downscaled emissions are lower than the activity baseline, then it will be applied at the baseline emissions level. We have similar guidance if there is no sector-specific NDC unconditional target. Then we undertake a conservative downscaling of the national reference scenario to the activity level. And again, if those downscaled emissions are lower, then they become the baseline emissions level. The last substantive step here is that there will be regular updates to the baseline. This is important to maintain the integrity of the underlying credit and activities. All baselines are updated within the start of each new NDC period. And we impose this guidance that the update of the baseline can never lead to a baseline becoming less stringent over time. We want to maintain that strict guidance to advise early movers and ensure that ambition increases over time. Last but not least, I'll mention that there's an option to set the baseline in a more conservative manner than outlined by this tool. Specifically, the crediting baseline can be further adjusted downwards to increase the share of emissions reductions toward the host country's NDC and long-term target. That's a topic that's covered in our general guidance document, so I'll just point to that as a concluding note. I think that's it, Axel, so I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Any clarification questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, again, Takachi Hongo. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting point, and maybe the related same point as at the additionality issues. So the alignment with NDC, it is a very interesting point, and it is actually required by the financial disclosure for the corporate operation. So this is a very important and interesting point. But how to check and the alignment with NDC. NDC is a national-based one, and in this case, a project or sector-based one. So on your plan, do you have a kind of the sector scenario for the NDC? Such kind of analysis is required or not? I'm not sure how to evaluate whether that would be the project is aligned with NDC. Could you explain it a little bit more, please? Thank you.
Yes, Clayton, if you would like to come in, please.
Yeah, Axel, I heard most of that question, so I'm going to give a response and then feel free to pile in. So thank you, Takashi. So I think just to clarify, we have scenarios for whether there's a sector-specific NDC or not. So if there is a sector-specific NDC, we downscale according to that. If there is not, we still attempt to downscale in a conservative manner. So the ambition is to downscale in both scenarios to provide a check on that activity. Obviously, downscaling when there is no sector-specific commitment or goal is going to be more challenging. And I think the finer details of this are probably going to be elaborated as we kind of continue the project. Axel, I'll look to you to fill in any details that I may have missed.
Yes, thank you. So, of course, the alignment with the NDC is a cross-cutting issue. It also relates, actually, we have a fourth document, background note that tries to address this in more detail. We've not presented it here, but it's available on the IIMT website as companion piece to the 3 other concept notes. So we are fully aware of the challenges that NDC alignments generate, and of course we would be more than happy to take specific inputs there. Any other clarification question from the audience? Yeah, well, Karsten, please.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting presentations. I have a question which goes in the same direction like the alignment with the NDC, but refers to a term which has been used by Sarah in her presentation regarding the target surplus, which in a specific way it's kind of similar testing if the country can afford any crediting, or if the host country still has to think about its own compliance with the NDC and can only credit the emission reductions which goes beyond their own needs for NDC fulfillment. So are these two issues linked the NDC alignment of the baseline and the target surplus under the additionality testing? Have you been coordinating on this approach? Thank you.
Thanks, Karsten. Clayton, do you want to come in? Clayton, Jessica, please. Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I think my answer is essentially yes, but I'll let Jessica and Axel elaborate.
Yeah. So of course both. Sorry, Jessica, please.
I mean, I guess the answer would be yes. Yes, we've been coordinating, and again, we're looking at that kind of the target surplus and the additionality. I think the question is just a little bit different from the question that's being asked in the baseline context, but they're certainly related. So with additionality, the question is really, is this type of activity, I mean, has it been defined within the NDC as something that's needed to meet the NDC, right? And then in the baseline area, the question is formulated a bit differently. It's more like, considering the NDC as kind of the minimum action required, and then what could you credit beyond that? So I think they're kind of looking at it from two different perspectives. But yes, we've been considering each other's work.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jessica and Clayton. Indeed, it's kind of two sides of the same coin, and it needs to be considered accordingly. I hope that we've been consistent in addressing it, but of course, we would invite anyone to look more closely at that and suggest if you think that there are inconsistencies. I would now like to invite Luca and Karsten to join me on the panel. We will now get into the generic panel discussion after having heard from the different experts about the concept notes. So in the panel discussion, we have fortunately still half of our original panel with us, so I'm really grateful for that. And we have a number of guiding questions for this discussion. The first one relating to, how can we harness the experience from the CDM? I mentioned that several of the CDM methodologies have been revised more than 20 times. So we've had a process in actually really polishing these methodologies. To what extent can such polished methodologies really make a difference under Article 6? The second question relates to the balance between high integrity and not getting too high transaction costs. All the academic literature says that there is a trade-off. With some measures you can reduce a trade-off, but I think you can never completely eliminate it. The third question relates to, you've heard about the additionality tool. What are the three key issues that you would comment on that tool? The fourth relates to MRV. We have, of course, in our MRV concept note looked at the classical approach to MRV. Now, of course, there is many digital MRV attempts coming up. For example, the Climate Warehouse of the World Bank, various blockchain initiatives, and so on. And last but not least, we have already discussed quite in detail the alignment with the NDC, with the long-term low-emission development strategy, with the Paris Agreement long-term goal. How can one do such alignments in a proper way? But so this is spanning the scene. I'm not expecting answers to all of those questions. Pick those that you think are most relevant. I would like to start with Luca and then pass over to Karsten. Thanks. Luca, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Axel, and good afternoon, colleagues. First, perhaps let me start by thanking you for the invitation, but also for congratulating the authors, because I think this is a very important first step. And Axel, as you were saying before, I hope that this will inspire the work of at least of the 6.4 supervisory body, but also would inspire bilateral cooperation among countries. So this is exactly what is needed at the moment to sort of allow me the pun, but put a benchmark on a high benchmark out there for these three important components. Perhaps another overarching reflection. When I was reading the concept notes, I think most of these, especially on additionality and baselines, these are relating, you were focusing on project-based activities. And this is only one part. There is also programs and policies that could be issuing credits under 6.4, but also be transacting ITMOs under 6.2. So this is just, I think, one tip of the iceberg, and it highlights how much work is needed before this can become operational. And if I may suggest perhaps one potential next step as well, could be that to have some practical examples, because I think these are very good principles that you're putting out there, and some of the questions that were also asked by Takashi and others before, I think it's that they could become clearer once we have example of what then, for instance, is what type of activities could be deemed additional under these new principles and which aren't, or the same for baselines, where the baseline is set. So I think that would be quite useful. Perhaps I'll try just to keep it as a sort of a dialogue. I don't want to take too much time. I'll try to focus on the first question, for instance, and then we can move on to Karsten. So basically, you ask how can we learn from the experience that already has been done, and as Martha was saying before, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. You also mentioned that there is quite a wealth of methodologies that have been developed, and they've been costly. There's been a lot of time and expertise that's been put by world-recognized experts that at the moment are here in this room, like you, and others that are in the other room negotiating. So I think there is a lot of important knowledge that is already being developed. At the same time, as Jessica was not only for methodology, but also on additionality. And perhaps a couple of points on additionality. As Jessica was, I think it was excellent, her presentation on what needs to be enhanced and what is new proposed under the concept note. I think the key here is the target SAR plus as has been presented, but there is a need to work on this aspect particularly well, because there are a lot of elements that could be left to the there are parameters that could lead to some uncertainty, and when there is uncertainty, like on several issues, like where do we set the even the regulatory additionality, which type of regulations are in, which type of regulations are out. I think it's quite important. So there are some elements under additionality that could learn from the CDM. Some others are completely new, and I think especially this group and also the supervisory body should pay more attention to these. And on baseline is instead, I think the approach that you are taking is excellent. I think is the right way to look at this. The CDM, of course, is a good basis. We have a lot of other methodologies also through the JCM, through gold standards and Vera that could be looked at. And I think there was a concept in the concept note that I particularly like, which is also the baseline protection, because we need to find this balance between, of course, conservativeness, but at the same time, we need to remember that the private sector as well needs to participate. And given the current additionality criteria that you're putting out and the very stringent baseline, we have to remember that we have automatic discounts with ONG, SOP. I think then what is left for crediting could be very, very tight. So having the baseline protection, and especially also the ITMO use within the credit within the NDC period are all limiting factors compared to the CDM. And so having this baseline protection, I see it as a small addition, but I think it's a very good and welcome point. And in terms of like CDM and 6.4, yes, the 250 plus methodologies are a very good start. At the same time, I think we published a paper a couple of years ago on looking at several methodologies, and we found out that there is, I think, applying some tools, it's perfect. But one also needs to look a little bit into the details of the methodologies, because it's true that there were some that have been developed over time and refined over time. But for instance, in one of the methodologies that we look at, which is one of the most used, the ACM 002, which you know very well, we found out that basically the consistent application of that in different contexts, because there were some parameters that could be chosen by the project developers, they didn't lead to conservative baselines eventually. So this is a critical element. Conservativeness was a criterion in the CDM. It is a criterion under Article 6.4 and under Article 6.2 as well, but then the application needs to be really thorough. I'll stop here, and perhaps I'll pass it over to Karsten.
Karsten, please.
Yes, thank you. Also from my side, I can just express that I appreciate this comprehensive approach to the changes, or to assess the changes needed between the old CDM world and the new Article 6.4 world, where any issuance of emission reductions has to be coupled with a corresponding adjustment if used for NDC compliance or other international mitigation purposes, and an authorization is needed. So for the host parties, indeed, it is a very important aspect to be aware what will be the implications of hosting this kind of projects, and to define an appropriate baseline and to make a careful additionality check to avoid any overcrediting or any losses or any situation of giving away credits which they need for their own NDC compliance. Therefore, both parts, the additionality check regarding the target surplus and the baselines, which has to be aligned with the NDC, are indeed very important steps where the information should be available in the host country. So this project and this comprehensive approach, where all the important parts, additionality testing, baseline setting, and MRV, are addressed in the same or in different papers, but under the same projects and assessed jointly, is a very important step forwards. I think a very important aspect of with a host party with the view of coming from taking the view of the host party would be a kind of dynamic assessment to avoid lock-in the long term or in the midterm, which would be the case if the baselines are fixed for a long time or for the several crediting periods, even more. So I think any attempts, any approaches to establish a kind of dynamic baseline, just already established under the CDM, should be picked up for the Article 6.4 baselines and by the supervisory body to make it the standard case. And the reduction coefficients seem to be one possible approach to do so, to bring the crediting baselines, to align them with the NDC or with a long-term goal.
Thank you very much for these introductory statements. Now, of course, I invite the audience to shoot questions, comments at us. Floor is open. We have the roving microphone, so please come in. Yeah, I already see a question at the back.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations. I have one question concerning the additionality. I think investment analysis is certainly a step forward to a more strong additionality case. At the same time, I still see a lot of leeway in the way the investment analysis are done in practice. Each company has its own practice how to do so. So I wonder what you think about the idea of introducing more transparency to the whole story by adding a layer or adding a feature in the additionality case which shows where the money goes, the carbon credits or the revenues from the carbon credits after the sale has taken place. Because I think that could strengthen the additionality case. Because let's say the project is not additional because the company didn't have an investment analysis before, the consultant came up with one or something like that. Or even the DOE asked to simplify the investment analysis, to not expose the case too much to the UNFCCC and so on. So I think it could be helpful to have more transparency where the money afterwards is reinvested, because that's the only way, in my opinion, or a very certain way to know if the money is used for another project, let's say an additional project later on. So I would like to hear what the panelists think about that idea.
Thank you. Any one of you would like to come in on the comment on this?
Yes, I think thank you for this proposal, for this idea, or for raising up the issue at least. I think following the money which has been come in when the project is realized might be quite a difficult issue to go that deep into the internal structures of the companies. And in the simplest case, the money is going back to the bank which provided the upfront finance. So it's always would be one way to, for project finance, you get the money at the beginning as a bank loan, and then of course you have to simply pay it back. So it's not sure if the money is reinvested into another kind of project, if it's just coming from a private sector acting bank which finance all kind of projects. But I think the aspect of presenting the impact which the revenues may have might be at least give an indicator of the additionality of this project. So it might be helpful to have this to assess the impact that revenues will have on the profitability of the project.
Thank you, Karsten. Luca, please.
Thanks. Very quickly, in terms of enhancing the transparency of the whole process, there was a concept that I particularly liked I think it was in the MRV concept note, that they discussed sort of the inability, or proposes the inability of project developers to pick and choose the verifiers, but like trying to have a pool that are randomly assigned, of course, with regional diversification, but that would already per se increase, in my opinion, the whole transparency of the process, given the history that we had in the CDM.
Yeah, thanks, Luca. Any further comment, question?
Could I come in a moment, please?
Yes, please, come.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting suggestion. Thank you for that. It's especially like coming from Colombia, from this region, we see a lot of projects in the forestry kind of land use area where there's participation of different communities actually in the implementation of those projects. And there has been a lot of call from those communities for there to be more transparency about how the carbon revenues from projects are actually spent, to ensure that the contributions of the communities are also being recognized via these carbon revenues. So I think that there are different sectors that are calling for increased transparency in the use of carbon revenues, and it's an interesting area where I think, perhaps not adding requirements, but highlighting the possibility for projects to report on that, and that could be a marker for a highly transparent project one that actually reports on what happens to the carbon revenues that it brings in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, please, Takashi, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I want to have two general comment, and this is a very interesting idea. And the first point is sector-wise guideline. So I think the guidance is important to, but I think for instance, energy efficiency and energy switch or fuel switch and forest-related management or land use change and the CCS. So all are different nature and characteristics. So the guidance, I think, is in a general, that will be very simple, is fine. And the next step is a sector-wise one. So two-step approach, I think, seems to be a reasonable one. And the second point is a timeline. This is a question, rather question. So the 6.4 is going to, in my understanding, is going to evaluate the 250 methodology. And of course, their work will start after the establishment of supervisory body. But this idea, the guidance is going to be finalized or finished in the early 2023. What kind of timeline are you, do you consider? How to reflect on the analysis or review process of supervisory body for 6.4? Or another word, another client of this approach is 6.2. So for instance, Japan developed JCM already gone, but already is moving. But the other country are really interested to develop their own 6.2 approach. So I think the two clients are there, not only the 6.4, but also 6.2. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the second question, our timing, of course, is meant to enable the supervisory body to pick up the results that we have achieved. And, well, we know the experience from CDM. There were various entities developing baselines and tools. Some were successful, others were not successful. So we would hope that with our initiative and its fully independent characteristics, the supervisory body would take it seriously and hopefully engage directly. Anyone who would like to comment on the first comment or question? Luca, please.
Thanks, Takashi, also for the question. I think the sectoral suggestion is very valid, especially because one of the key issues to be resolved for the additionality tool, but also interlink with the baseline, as we were discussing before, and this is this relation with the NDC. And there are many NDCs for which deriving or scaling down the sectoral baseline for different sectors is very complicated. And I've seen, I think it was in the baseline or in the additionality concept note that you suggested to take IA or IPCC scenarios for baselines where there is no enough detail for NDCs, which of course I understand these are the generally agreed, and of course I'm biased, but at the same time I must admit that even our scenarios, they are not country specific, right? And I think it was referred to carbon intensity for benchmarks, and we do have carbon intensity for benchmarks different years, but they are regional. And different countries within the same region might have, we try to do our best to approximate, but given the current goals of the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to be as precise as possible. So having a sectoral approach, disaggregated as much as possible per region, per country, I think is the best. Of course, it would entail, I don't know how many months or years of work, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Karsten, please.
Yes, maybe one addition to the question of investment analysis for projects. I think there might be, when you do an investment analysis, some easy cases where it's obvious that it's economically unattractive, and there are other cases where it's clear that it's an attractive option, and there's a middle ground where the project may or may not be economically unattractive. And I like the idea very much reflected in this, or proposed in this concept note, in this draft, that the length of the crediting period or the renewal of the crediting period could be linked to the security which you have in your investment analysis. So if your project is only marginally unattractive, it might be a good idea to keep to accept this additionality and to approve the project only for one crediting period, with a clear expectation that in the flow of time we come to a situation where this kind of project is not additional anymore. So this is another dynamic feature which I think is should be worth, or no, it's worth to be considered when the supervisory body developed its tool and or its criteria for the additionality check.
Thank you. We now have our last question, please.
Okay. Hello, I'm Andrea Bonzani from AITA. Thank you very much for the event, and thanks for the work on methodologies, which is absolutely critical, especially given the slow pace of we're seeing in standing up the 6.4 body. I missed the first part of the event. I was following the negotiations upstairs, so apologies in advance if the point I'm going to raise was covered in the first part of the event. I'd like the panel to elaborate on the concept of NDC alignment, because I see the risk of perverse incentives for certain countries by arguing that only what is above and beyond the NDC of a country we may lead to a situation where countries are incentivized to keep the NDC less ambitious in order to credit and sell their surplus, and the opposite risk would be for countries with ambitious NDCs to be penalized and not being able to attract investment and technologies. So I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on this and how we avoid this risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me come in on that. Of course, we have this temporal continuum, short period NDC, longer period LT LEDS, and very long period long-term goal of the Paris Agreement. I would think that we should really apply the approach that uses the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement as the key anchor. And that brings me back to the ambition coefficient. With the ambition coefficient, we don't care whether the NDC is overestimated or underestimated. We treat countries, let's say, in a similar fashion. And of course, in the CDM, we've seen what happens if we try to prevent perverse incentives by exempting policies through the E-. So I would think that indeed, if we get a good long-term anchoring of the methodological approaches, we can at least reduce the perverse incentive question. But yeah, please.
Yes, I think I fully agree that the most important, or one very important thing, is to avoid this lock-in for and keep the whole system dynamic and allow for long-term view, which makes it clear for the host parties to see which impact this crediting may have, and to make a clear midterm policy that you can use projects and crediting in some sectors, for instance, to get the sector prepared for a stronger NDC in the next period. I mean, if you really have the incentive to go to weaken your NDC just to allow for crediting, I think that there's something which has to be this issue is existing in the old world of the CDM as well, and I think this issue has to be cleared at the political level, where each country, each party has to report on its effort and how this use of the market mechanisms will contribute, for instance, in the reporting duties under Article 6, will contribute to their NDCs and to their long-term policy.
Thank you, Karsten. With that, we've come to the end of our event. I would like to thank you for actively participating. I commend the Secretariat for the very good technological setting that our virtual participation was done in a very flawless manner. And look out for the next event on the initiative at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I give you the microphone back? Oh, yes, of course. Thank you. Cheers. You're welcome.